people who have done a multi-day hiking trip, such as the Appalachian Trail. What is your horror story from the trip? Night 1 of a trip at Sleeping Giant in Canada, I believe. First night out. I'm always a little jumpy because it takes a while to get used to the sound of the woods. And this was no exception. It was a solo trip. So just me in a little tent on the edge of the forest, looking out onto a small slope down onto a pebble beach. I was having some real trouble getting to sleep. The woods were just so loud and my mind kept jumping to serial killer instead of normal wildlife. I was trying to convince myself otherwise when I hear some heavier footsteps, breaking twigs. My heart is in my throat because I just know I'm going to die all alone in the Canadian backwoods. Then I hear a crash and some falling rocks directly outside my tent. And I work up the courage to turn on my flashlight and unzip the door to have a look. At which point I catch a glimpse of the very clumsy woodland elk that had just fallen down the slope onto the beach right in front of me. Didn't die. I was on a canoe camping trip, on a long narrow lake. My wife and I had set up camp about halfway along the lake. And all was well. After dark I went to wash my face in the lake. And I see two lights on the other side of the lake. It was only like 50 meters wide. As I'm watching, their headlamps fade and die. And then something big starting snorting over there. A moose or a bear. It was pretty loud. It was a still night. And so I called out to them. Hey, are you all right? It turns out they had accidentally started hiking from the wrong parking lot, delaying them an hour or two, and then when they got to the lake, they had hiked down the wrong side of the lake. So I offered, and then went and picked them up in my canoe, and lent them a flashlight so they could set up. I think they were pretty relieved to have gotten away from whatever animal that was. If I hadn't been there, that would have had hours of hiking to get to the next campsite. Without lamps. I was backpacking in the Sierras with a couple friends. And we were crammed into a small tent. For most of the trip we were in backcountry, but had come down to a more established campground to check out some waterfalls. The campground had attracted a sow bear with her 2 cubs. So we used our bear cans and left all the zippers open on our packs so she could dig through them without damaging them. Sometime in the middle of the night, we wake up to snuffling around our camp. We sit up in the tent, shoulder to shoulder, listening. There's so many of us in the tent that my shoulder is touching the side fabric. And something bumps into me through the tent wall. A bear, with cubs, bumped into me. We held our breaths until she snuffled farther away. Then banged the pots we'd brought into the tent until we were pretty sure she was scared off. Not hiking but kayaking. My father and I took a multi-day kayaking trip on Yellowstone Lake. He totally underestimated how far away the campsites were over water, and what we thought would be a 3-hour kayak trip was an 8-hour kayak trip. Got there and set up camp and enjoyed it, but we were supposed to leave to another site the next day. That didn't happen. A storm that wasn't on the forecast rolled in and we ended up, quite literally, holding the tent from blowing away. We used every ounce of rope. Thankfully Dad always packed extra to tie it down, and we still ended up holding the rods from inside the tent. The third day it let up a bit and we realized we had to get the hell out. That was almost worse. We had to kayak back. About half through the weather went bad and we were fighting against the wind and rain. Took 10 hours to get back, fighting against white water on a damn lake. I was 15 and I was exhausted, cranky, and so sore I didn't move from the car the next day. LOL. Oh. And no cell phone reception. You are lucky. Some Boy Scouts got caught in bad weather and canoes on Yellowstone Lake. Several drowned. Day 3 of 5 was at a waterfall. There were a few large flat rocks maybe 500 feet from the base of the falls that were large enough to fit a tent. So that's what me and my tent mate did. It rained that evening. The rock we pitched on was raised from the surrounding river by a few feet when we set up camp, but the river quickly swelled once the rain started. To complicate things, the wind coming off the falls was pushing the falls-facing wall of the tent in by about a foot or so, and rain was pouring horizontally through the space where the two zippers meet. At one point during the storm, I stepped out with the intent of moving our packs to higher ground, and while I was doing so my tent mate decided to get a look at the situation as well. Well, as soon as he stepped out, the tent instantly caught a gust of wind and was swallowed by the river. Sleeping bags and all. Lucky for us there were a few solo guys in our group with extra room in their tents. But sleeping in a cramped 5-person tent with no sleeping bag or pads is not a fun experience in the least. The following morning we were able to fish our tent and lost gear off the river rocks below. The tent was a complete loss as both the rods were snapped in multiple sections and our sleeping bags and gear were waterlogged. We had to hit the trail though in order to make it to our next destination by nightfall, so we had no choice but to pack everything up and hike with all the extra weight. Somehow, we made it to our destination shortly after lunch and were blessed with a sunny grassy clearing and an awesome dude in our party who thought to bring rope so we could string a clothesline and dry out our gear before the evening. I learned a few valuable lessons on that trip. 1. Don't camp in the middle of a river. 2. Lash your tent down. 3. Bring rope because it's just handy to have. 4. The other people in your party might have to save your dumb ass one day, so be humble. 5. Get a camp towel. A full-size terry cloth beach towel is like 20 pounds when soaking wet, and I would have done anything to yeet that thing off the side of a cliff if I had been a littering asshole. One day, fresh out of college with no friends in the area, I hiked a rough, unmarked herding trail in the mountains I was somewhat familiar with on a hot August day by myself. It followed along a beautiful stream lined with spruce trees and tall grass along the banks. Very picturesque. It was a designated wilderness area with few official recreational trails nearby. However, because it was in the tall grass and I wore pants worried about ticks, I got hot really fast. Sweating up a storm, I came to a nice bend in the river way out in no man's land. I stopped at this point and decided that river was looking extra inviting, so I stripped down to nothing and waded into the water. Wasn't worried about anyone stumbling upon me as no one really knew about this trail. The water was ice cold, and deeper than I thought, but totally worth it. After cooling down sufficiently, I decided to go see what was around that river bend. Wading through the water at chest depth, I was relatively silent. Got closer to the bend and peered around the corner slowly. Saw more spruce trees. A rock. Then another small spruce tree. And next to that a giant bull moose in the water, having a nice drink. I froze. He was less than 50 feet from me. And he didn't know I was there because I was so silent. Trying my hardest not to make a sound while also panicking, I slowly but quickly turned around in the water and rushed back to shore, trying not to make a sound. Except every time I exhaled, I said I don't want to die under my breath for some reason. I think it was a slight panic attack as I was alone deep in the woods naked in the water with a bull moose. I got back to shore, gathered my clothes, and ran totally naked through the woods for quite a distance before stopping to at least put shoes and underwear on. Continued running until I got out of the woods and back to my car and sat there until the shaking stopped and I could drive home. TLDR. I accidentally went skinny dipping with a bull moose in the middle of the wilderness. Hiked 50 miles of the Appalachian Trail with some friends after graduating high school. We did 12 miles a day for 4 days. Took us pretty much all day each day to get all 12 miles done. Except for the last day. I woke up with the worst diarrhea of my life. Shat my brains out thoroughly at sunrise. We hiked those last 12 miles before lunch. Also, 3 out of the 4 of us found deer ticks. We thought the 4th guy was quite lucky. Turns out he also had a deer tick, but he just didn't find it. The poor guy got Lyme disease.